Good evening, everyone. I'm Katie McDonough, a deputy editor at The New Republic, where I oversee Sold Short, our desk on inequality. I want to welcome you to our Salon series, which tonight features our contributing editor, Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw, in conversation with Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal about her new book, Use the Power You Have, A Brown Woman's Guide to Politics and Political Change. I'm also happy to present this evening's talk in partnership with our friends at Politics and Prose. So I think our panelists tonight need no real introduction, but I will try to offer one anyway. In 2016, Congresswoman Jayapal was elected to the House of Representatives by the people of Washington's 7th District, becoming the first Indian American woman to serve in that role and bringing a much needed, clear-eyed progressive vision to the chamber. She was reelected 2 years later, and in her tenure so far has fought for transparency and accountability in government, taken on student debt, and introduced a just beautifully comprehensive Medicare-for-all bill. Use the Power You Have is the Congresswoman's account of the path from 16-year-old Indian immigrant to grassroots activist to state senator and to now progressive powerhouse in DC. It's also my real pleasure to welcome my colleague, Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw, the co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum and a professor of law at UCLA. Please excuse the ambient sounds of New York City you might be able to hear right now. And a professor of law at UCLA and the Columbia Law School. Her decades of leadership through her development of intersectionality, critical race theory, and the Say Her Name campaign have given us both the framework to make meaning of our current moment and build something more just. She is a leading authority on civil rights, Black feminist legal theory, and race, racism, and the law. Professor Crenshaw and Congresswoman Jayapal are going to chat for about 45 minutes, and then I will open it up to you for questions. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A tool on your bar at the bottom of your Zoom page, and you could submit those. And I will now hand it over to our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie, for those wonderful introductions. It's really an honor to be here with the New Republic, and especially with Representative Pramila Jayapal. We were talking yesterday, and of all the questions I was really excited to ask her, and there were a lot, we've got a lot to talk about. The most important one was I wanted to figure out how she managed to finish this book in the midst of some of the craziest times we've ever experienced in American history. And I really asked and prodded, what are your tips? How do you step away? How do you get this important work done? I want to know her secret, and hopefully by the time we get through this conversation, you'll have her secrets as well. Before we dive into today's conversation, I'm going to pass it over to Representative Jayapal to read an excerpt from her book, Use the Power You Have, A Brown Woman's Guide to Politics and Political Change. The representative from Washington's 7th District has the floor.
Thank you so much, Kimberlé. I am just so thrilled to be here with you, and your leadership has been amazing over the years to watch. So this is a real treat for me. And of course, thank you to the New Republic and to Politics and Prose. This is the book, and it's been 8 years in the making, which I can tell you about. It's changed many times in terms of what it is, but it really is a chronicle of how we organize wherever we might be for the kind of political change that we want to see in the world. And I thought I would read just a short little excerpt from the 3rd chapter, which is called Why Not Me? Running for Office. And I think that this hopefully will give you an encapsulation of many of the different pieces and themes of the book. I never thought I would run for office. For 20 years, I had been an activist pushing for change from the outside. I had used every tool I could think of in my toolbox to advocate for positive changes on issues from immigration to environmental justice to economic inequality. I had led voter registration drives, rallies, marches, even nonviolent civil disobedience actions where I was arrested twice. I deeply believed that organizing, advocacy, and storytelling by real people were what made change happen. Truth be told, I was quite cynical about elected officials. Over the course of my 2 decades of organizing, I saw too few who were willing to use their positions to exercise leadership, particularly when an issue was seen as controversial. The things I had seen, government incursions into civil liberties post 9/11, Islamophobia, and anti-immigrant sentiment, among others, regularly required people who were willing to speak out before an issue was popular. And yet too many elected officials were inclined to wait before speaking out. They followed rather than led. Even in my state, where we did have some champions and some successes, it took enormous amounts of pushing and in some cases years to get the attention of elected officials. I was also deeply frustrated at the lack of diversity and representation I saw among those who held elected office. Low-income people, people of color, immigrants, women, and other marginalized communities were simply not represented. As an activist, I had to explain for too long, too hard, and too loudly about what seemed like obvious problems to me. Many in government had been there for a long time and did not seem to understand what life was actually like for the huge number of their constituents who had very different backgrounds and experiences from them. Even in the Democratic Party, few elected officials were willing to talk about race or class or take on stereotypes that were baked into the policies that even Democrats proposed. Perhaps the struggle around race and moneyed interests should not have been surprising to me or any other student of history. Just look at slavery and the Dixiecrats, President Lyndon Johnson's war on crime, which increased the incarceration of Black and brown people, and President Bill Clinton's promise to, quote, end welfare as we know it, which led to cutting aid to poor people, as well as his draconian 1996 immigration bill, which criminalized immigrants and expanded detention and deportation without due process. As an activist, I had even taken on President Obama, Barack Obama, for being the deporter in chief, a still unpopular, but in my view, necessary critique of an otherwise extremely popular president. I had taken mental note of a long list of times when Democrats said talking about race was divisive, or that we shouldn't focus on institutionalized racism because it would push away white voters, or that certain policies to rectify the wrongs we saw would be counter to our interests in some false analysis of national security or safety. When I first began organizing after September 11th around the detention and deportation of Muslims and Arabs, there were very few elected officials willing to stand with me. National security concerns triumphed over civil rights and civil liberties because once again, communities of color were treated as the suspicious other. When I began organizing rallies outside mosques to protest the lack of due process for Muslim Americans and Arab Americans who were being secretly detained and deported in the middle of the night, it became even more difficult to find elected leaders who would stand with us. And the higher the elected official rose, the harder it seemed to be to get them to take a stand that might be seen as controversial. Back then, immigration reform was far from popular. And it took years to convince our own congressional delegation to boldly embrace humane and just immigration reform. My first light bulb moment about how to build greater political power for immigrants came in 2004. I had realized that elected officials seemed to only care about two things. First, money from donors and corporate lobbyists, which seemed to work to block courageous votes or action. And second, and sometimes in this order, the votes of their own constituents. We didn't have money, but couldn't we organize existing voters, maybe even register new voters? Could we mobilize those voters to build the political power of immigrants and demand that politicians respond to our community's needs? The truth was, too many immigrants had lost faith in government and they didn't vote. Like me, they didn't see elected officials who represented them, looked like them, or even understood their lives. Some even just sat out the elections because they felt cynical about the people who were running and their desire to really serve them and make a difference. Many had also not received the kind of civic education that allowed them to understand the basic processes of voting in the United States, which are far from simple for a new American in this country. Could we get them to care about and trust the power of the vote? I decided to try an experiment. Hate Free Zone, the organization I had started at the time, partnered with the brand new Seattle chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations to implement a new pilot project designed to get Muslim Americans educated about and registered to vote, and then actually turned out to vote. We went into mosques and community centers and registered some 300 new Muslim American voters. They were well aware of the terrible things that were happening to their communities in the years after 9/11. But our job was to convince them that their voices and their votes would make a difference. That required a lot of conversation, education, and ultimately mobilization to get them to the polls when it was time to vote. And in the end, 98% of them voted. Armed with a successful pilot project, we began a much larger voter registration drive in 2005 and 2006, ultimately registering over 27,000 new American citizens to vote. It was the largest voter registration drive in the history of our state, and it caught the attention of elected officials. At approximately the same time, we began a big, successful statewide campaign that pushed Washington's Governor Christine Gregoire to establish a New Americans Policy Council and to fund a massive program to help legal permanent residents who were eligible to get their citizenship. If I had ever questioned what it really means to build political power, those successes made me see that working now. And yet, in spite of all of that work, we still fought frustrating battles to get elected officials to come out and support us, particularly against unjust and cruel enforcement measures against immigrants. So all of this contributed to my own distrust of elected officials and kept me away from the idea of running for office myself. Community members would often mention the possibility to me, but it's notable that nobody from the Democratic Party machine asked me to run. I was not part of the system. I was pushing people hard for what I believed was necessary, and I was not wealthy or well-connected, all viewed as negatives to the party machine that had a lot to say about who would run for office, or at least who would get the needed early support. As activists, what I realized is we were critical of the way government worked, and yet at the same time, we turned up our own noses at the idea of running for office ourselves. I realized that in our own judgmental way, we were ceding important political space to others instead of occupying it ourselves. What if we began to think about running for office as a way to organize more people, to connect people to the government, to bring organizing from the outside to the inside, to have the proverbial seat at the table, but to use it to lead and not just to follow? It was the beginning of the formation of my new theory of change. For years, I had believed that if politics is the art of the possible, then it's our job as activists to push the boundaries of what is seen as possible, but from the outside. Why couldn't that pushing also occur from the platform of elected office? Why couldn't an elected office could be the biggest organizing platform yet? Perhaps part of the problem was that there weren't enough of us on the inside to do the pushing. And I realized that you really needed people working from both the inside and the outside for change to happen as quickly as necessary. We don't get a more responsive government unless we systematically run organizing campaigns to change the way that government works. We don't understand what we're really dealing with or how to change it unless we actually know how it works now. And we don't get a more powerful and progressive group of elected officials unless we insert ourselves into the equation. We cannot organize on the inside if we have no organizers on the inside. In other words, we don't get a more representative government unless we run it ourselves. I decided it was time to run for the Washington State Senate.
Thank you so much for that. I have to say that I didn't quite know what to expect when I started reading the book, and it was such an engaging story, including cliffhangers like that, like what was going to happen when you decided to throw your hat in the ring and become an elected official. So following that journey, I think what I'd love to do is to take up what you just talked about the challenge of being a progressive elected official. Some challenges which I want to explore potentially as occupational hazards of being a progressive and being an elected official. And talk a little bit about our side of the aisle, the Democratic Party. And then you and I used a common metaphor, the myth of Sisyphus. And I want to talk a little bit about what's on either side of the Sisyphusian struggle, if we can call it that. So let me start with just the first part about the book itself. So I know that the book went through many different iterations, and I think it would be really great to hear about its trajectory, and particularly now what it is that you are writing for, what are you writing to, what are you trying to do with the story that you're telling in the book?
Yeah, first of all, I love writing. I was an English major in college. I talk a little bit about that against my father's wishes, who wanted me to really be an economics major. But I just love writing and I love reading. And I think it's so important for the world, but also for me, it's an important way to process what I'm learning, what I'm seeing. But you never know exactly who you're writing the book for. And when I first got the book contract, it was back in 2013, it was going to be a book on immigration. I had spent decades working on immigration issues and starting the largest immigrant advocacy organization and doing many of those things. And I felt like there was a real need to talk about immigration. I will say that that is still the case. But in the ensuing year, I decided to run for the state Senate. And so I called my publisher and said, I'm really sorry, I don't think I'm going to get the book done. And I'm also not sure I still want to do a book on immigration. And he said that was okay. And, give me another year. And then another year went by and I said, oh, you know what? Now I'm running for Congress. And finally last year, he said, okay, it's time. You have a lot of stuff to share here and we need it. But I think that in this moment, when there are many people across this country in the wake of a cruel, racist, xenophobic, constitutionally destroying president who feel helpless because they're watching things happen that perhaps some of them could never imagine happening in the United States of America. There are the incredibly painful but necessary and inspiring uprisings across the country, an awakening around a mass movement that is really using its power to demand changes that perhaps 3 years ago we didn't know, or 2 years ago we didn't know would be possible. Even a conversation about reparations on a main stage, or the police reforms that we're trying to pass in Congress, not nearly enough, but still sweeping in terms of what Congress has done on police reform, which is just about nothing, to the devastation of COVID. And so I hope that in this book, there are opportunities for people to do a couple of things. One, see the power they have as individuals to come together for the common good and for the collective. And to have some lessons, particularly if you're a woman, if you're a brown woman, if you're a minority in any sense of the word, that you would be able to see the struggles that go on with all of us, because we're all human, in trying to find our voice and fight for our voice. Yes. Second, that we have an unprecedented opportunity to see the connections. Kimberlé, something that you have really led the conversation on at the national level, talking about intersectionality before other people even had thought about the word or knew what it meant. And that has been the approach to my organizing for decades. But this moment is allowing us an unprecedented opportunity to see how deeply we really are interconnected, and to see how an injustice to all to one is an injustice to all, to see how COVID and racism and anti-Blackness and white supremacy and economic devastation, much of which existed in different forms prior to the pandemic hitting, but now has been brought to light. So there is a chapter at the very end where I talk about the three supremacies that we have to take on: white supremacy, individual supremacy, and corporate supremacy. And I do think that those threads are very pertinent to this moment, even though that chapter was written back in the fall, and there's been a lot that's happened since then.
It's amazing in some ways to write into the moment, not yet having reached that moment. So this book is coming at precisely, the time that it's meant to come. And because we share the same publisher, I'm going to ride on that. And so thank you so much for giving me that framework. So I want to talk a little bit about the aspects of being a progressive elected official. And you mentioned two things in the excerpt that you just read to us. And I was really curious about two things. So you talked about basically being a progressive is as folks who are articulating things that other folks haven't caught up to yet, right? It's being out in front. They are the ones who are advocating for an issue before the issue becomes popular. So that's the progressive. And then you have your sort of mainstream elected official whose inclination is to wait before speaking out, not jumping ahead, not articulating the things that are going to become popular. So it made me wonder whether being a progressive leader is just an occupational hazard. I mean, if the primary directive of most politicians is to get reelected, and they believe the best way to get reelected is not to lead, basically, but to follow, then progressive politicians, if they're really leading, are constantly walking that thin line between being a visionary and actually being able to be elected. I suspect that's what the mainstream thinks, but maybe that's getting it wrong. So what might people not be understanding about being a progressive elected official? The equation might be different.
Device is offline.
Yeah, well, I do say in the book that, my definition of a progressive is just that we are the first ones to the best and most just ideas. And then we work to make them popular. But I think that there's a myth that, that is out there that a lot of politicians believe, which is that you follow the polling and where people are today is where they want you to be as their elected official. And my belief is very different. It is that we do have a lot of power in this platform, and people are looking to us to lead. They didn't elect us. Of course, they elected us because they believed in the values. Number one, they don't have to agree with us on 100% of issues in order to vote for us. I have many constituents who I know, and they tell me, because I do town halls all the time, they tell me that they don't agree with me on every issue, but what they do believe is that I am trying to do what I believe is the best thing after listening to all of the input, gathering all of the data, and they trust my judgment. They may not agree with it every step of the way, but they trust my judgment. Number two, that, when you think about the platform we have, we can change public opinion. Unfortunately, Donald Trump has done this on numerous levels by using the platform he has to the fullest and to cruel effect, to xenophobic and racist effect. But he has changed how people think about certain issues. And we can do that to good effect. We can do that to benefit people. We can make the argument for why we should not be spending $758 billion on military budgets instead of investing in people's needs and necessities. We can make the argument why we should have a universal healthcare system, and we can lean into that and bring people along with us as we talk about Medicare-for-all. We can talk about the absolute myths and injustices of incarceration, whether it's immigrant incarceration or the criminal justice system, and all the reforms that need to be taken into account as we rethink public safety and policing. And so all of these things, I think, are places where, sure, we of course want to get reelected, but I also think that we've got to speak our values. And America is in a dire place, Kimberly. You and I have talked about this many times. We cannot afford more incremental change with people who are just in office in order to be reelected. I say that we got to fight for what is really going to enhance people's lives. And if in the process of doing that and doing it as well as I can and listening to as many people as I can, I get unelected, then, at least I know that I've used the platform for good. That's how I think about it. And so I think we just have to continue to try to lead in that way and get rid of these myths that you can listen to polling and let that drive what you do, or that you can speak only to mythical, swing district voters, but forget about your entire base and the actual swing district voters who are young people and folks of color who don't see themselves represented enough in politics.
Absolutely. I've been one to say many times when I've been told by a pollster that I can't say X or Y to achieve whatever goal we have. I say that I'm so glad that that industry wasn't around during the March on Washington, because nothing of Martin Luther King's speech could have been said, right? That's
right.
what, the overall point is. This is not going to play in Peoria. So
that's right.
It's so good to have elected activists such as yourself to prove that a lot of the ways in which politics is turned into sort of a choreography to go along with poll numbers doesn't have to be that way. One of the things that I wonder about is why there's so much dissonance within the activist progressive community when it comes to running for office. I mean, you spelled out some of it in terms of what you saw, but it also seems that radicals on the other side, the anti-government, far right, doesn't seem to reject governmental power. In fact, they pay a lot of attention to who's elected. They even run for election, and they support, a president who they say carries their water for them. So is there some way that it makes sense to understand why radical thought on the right seems far more prepared to go into government to pursue their objectives than progressives on our side of the aisle?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the right has been very disciplined about investing in institutions that support that work, whether it's, research institutions that say what they want to be said about any issue, or whether it's actually understanding that if you do have the power and the platform and you work quickly and diligently and fiercely, that you can actually tip the scales to the thing that you want to have happen. And we've seen that, of course, with the Freedom Caucus and others on the right. And I think for us on the left, there is, I mean, even when I ran, I had a lot of my activist friends who said to me, why are you running, Pramila? That's such a waste of your talent. You should, why would you want to compromise like that by going into government? And that's what I meant when I talked about turning up our noses at it. But we really are ceding an incredibly important powerful platform to make the change that we see. And I think that is starting to change. Of course we stand on people's shoulders, right? So Shirley Chisholm, I read her autobiography and that was really compelling for me. Barbara Lee, it's not like we didn't have organizers in office, but we didn't have a lot of them. And there was this overall sense that this is not something that we do. I think that's changed. I feel like I was on the earlier edge of that. Certainly in 2018, we got the squad in to Congress, and we got a number of other, really progressive organizing types in. And now I see that happening again, and it's happening at every level of government, from city council, to state legislature, to the federal government. Because one of the things that changes is I've had a lot of people say to me, until I saw you there, I didn't think that it was something that I could do. And now that I see you there, I feel like my future is different, and something different is possible for me. And that is both in terms of the acceptance of the idea of organizers running for government and elected office, but it's also in terms of being a brown immigrant woman and showing that, yeah, we can do these things. And there are barriers, huge barriers here, but we can make a difference if we're here, recognizing that it's a very different environment and there are different roles that people play at different times when you're on the inside.
Yes. And so much of it is about having a critical mass, right? One can say in any of the institutions that we're in, if you're the only one or one of a
Such a great picture you've put up there. When you talk about critical mass and you see the Judiciary Committee and, the entire Republican side is all white male. And then there's, of course,
And
some
then
of us.
just before, there was the picture of you with the squad, which, as I said to you yesterday, I see you as being part of the squad. So it's the squad. So I guess you're, sort of the big sister to the squad. But it's just such a refreshing way of reimagining what representation actually looks like, to see the squad and the older sisters doing the work that they do. Which brings me then to the question of the Democratic Party. So I want to talk about that just for a moment, because you talk about it in the book. And one of the things that actually struck me is your discussion about the embargo against talking about race that was at one point a centerpiece of Democratic Party politics. And I would suspect that there are some newly activated people listening now who might be surprised or, not quite, clear about what we're talking about. So what can you remind us about the recent histories in which the suppression of race discourse, the inability to talk about the issues that we've been talking about over the last 6 weeks was very much a part of the Democratic sort of their sense of their conditions of possibility?
Well, absolutely. And I mentioned a few in the little excerpt I read, but you look back, it's been Democratic presidents who have really suppressed and oppressed people of color and low-income communities. I mean, you look at the incarceration system and the criminalization of migration, the criminalization of marijuana possession, the way in which we have just continued to assign different punishments for different people based on their race and ethnicity. And I think that it has been Democrats who pushed forward some of these ideas, sometimes in the worst neoliberal language. I think that the continuation, and you've got a picture of Joe Biden up there. This was, I think, maybe it was during the Anita Hill hearings, and many of us watched those hearings, and it was very, very challenging. And so I think that we cannot forget that the Democratic Party, and I'm a Democrat, I run as a Democrat, I believe in changing the party from within, and I believe that it requires us taking some real risks to take on both the party, but also the overall understanding of some of these issues, which too many Democrats, including those who aren't in elected office, have bought into.
Yeah.
So, when you think about national security and you think about post 9/11, yes, it was George Bush, but frankly, Democrats did not stand up, and we bought in to the idea of national security as a reason to have incursions on civil liberties. And so up and down the line, you can see that this has been happening. And I guess what I would say that is inspiring, yes, you have the police and ICE. This is a perfect example of where Democrats have continued to buy into a narrative around ICE enforcement and a cruel enforcement agency, when really what we need to do is just buck whatever you think of being as, the polling that stops you from moving forward on humane, comprehensive immigration reform that gives a pathway to citizenship to undocumented immigrants and allows people to actually reunite with their families and allows people to come here and work and contribute in all the ways that we see as necessary. So I think these are things that, if you want to be depressed, you can look at the history, but if you want to be inspired, you can also look at how far we've come on some of these issues in terms of what the mainstream Democratic platform is. Just a simple example, $15 minimum wage, which I think should be a living wage. But when we passed it in Seattle, became the first major city to pass the $15 minimum wage, it was because of the courage of fast food workers who walked out on their jobs in restaurants across the country and built a movement of working people demanding change. But it was also then the partnership that we had to change that law at the local level, now so many cities and states across the country, that it's become a mainstream Democratic thing. You notice it was never brought up during the debates because all of the Democratic candidates now agree that we should have a $15 minimum wage. So, and we passed it on the House floor last year. So I think that this is unfortunately the very difficult long work of bringing about change when racism, sexism, anti-Blackness, white supremacy, gender inequity, all of these things have been built in and baked into our systems. It takes time to change these, even when we know how urgent it is that it happens today.
Yes. And you talk about sometimes having some difficult conversations within the family, as it were. And some of those conversations you pointed out in the excerpt you just read to us, Clinton's ending welfare as we know it, the role he played in creating immigration. And importantly, you also pointed out that you've had to take some courageous steps to talk about how the Obama administration has been framed as the deporter in chief, partly because of their role in deporting undocumented people. So, as a fellow critic of a very popular president for one of his policies that was problematic, his immigration, me, my brother's keeper, it's really difficult to lay a serious critique of someone who otherwise represents our party, represents our interests. Even those who might agree with us sometimes say, well, maybe you should take it light on that. So I think we know the costs of laying critique and opposing certain aspects of policies of popular presidents, but do we really understand what the costs and consequences of not holding to our progressive principles when it's our friends who we see as going in a different direction? So what would you say the lesson was from critiquing the immigration policy of a very popular Democratic presidency? What are the costs of not doing so?
Well, I think that, it's so beautifully stated what you just said, because I think that the cost, and we often think about how difficult it is in the moment, and of course it's difficult, but the reality is we have laid the groundwork for this administration to do everything that they have done on immigration, the cruelty of family separation and other things. Much of that groundwork started after 9/11, maybe before that, with Bill Clinton actually in 1997, with the immigration bill, terrible criminalization that started then of migration and has gone up through post 9/11 and then even into President Obama's tenure. And the cost of not fixing that is that we leave immigration out there as a political football to divide us. That is all that President Trump has done since he was campaigning all the way to today, where every chance he gets, if he's down in the polls, if he's whatever's happening, he goes to immigrants and immigration and race as a way to try and play to his base. If we had passed humane immigration reform and, if we'd had enough people who were courageous enough to say that, these enforcement things are completely unnecessary, we were detaining 56,000 immigrants every single night in immigration prisons, private for-profit prisons. That's what they are. And the vast majority of those people had never committed a crime, much less been charged of a crime. And if they had, it was something like marijuana possession. Certainly didn't require being, locked up and deported, as we've seen in the criminal justice system as well. And so I think that the cost is both political in that sense, and you can see that also with this president. How did Donald Trump get elected? Well, Trump is both a symptom and a cause, as I talk about in the book. We can get rid of the cause part in November if everyone comes out and votes him out of office. But the symptom of deep inequity in this country, the largest wealth inequality and income inequality since the 1920s, 60% of Americans having not even $400 in their bank account to deal with an emergency. The low wage worker nature of so much of what happens in this country, and the CEO pay that is just so vastly gross to look at in comparison to what the average worker has. All of those kinds of inequities just lay the groundwork for a president like Donald Trump to come in and exploit us. So if we don't get healthcare right and provide seriously universal, affordable, accessible healthcare for everyone, that's why I'm the lead sponsor of Medicare-for-all, that is what I believe we should be doing, then we will end up once again, even if Joe Biden wins in 2020, we may create the conditions for a Donald Trump-like figure to exploit the divisions again and the unhappiness and injustices in order to get him elected. So we really have to think about those costs of not acting and not acting boldly.
Yes, yes. So on that note, I wonder if you might say something about the three supremacies that you were talking about, and as you sort of give us a sense of the baseline or the grounding against which our failure to interrogate and interrupt becomes the condition of possibility for a Trump. I mean, that's largely what's it's there, it's laying around. You can pick it up and use it politically. And so as we think about those three supremacies, the other sort of piece of it is how anti-Blackness is also central to that, even part of all of the other kinds of debates that we're having. And I think it's being much more salient in this moment where anti-Blackness is playing a role as well. So I wonder if you might speak about how you think about those three supremacies.
Yeah, and I should just back up and say that the book is sort of divided into two pieces, or maybe three if you include the last chapter as sort of a set of lessons. But the first part is really about my movement from organizer on the outside to being in Congress, and all of trying to peel back the curtains on what happens in Congress, what happens in elected office, and how we sort of have to deal with the many things that are thrown at us, hopefully with a lot of lessons along the way and specific examples. The second part is called Moral Visions, and somebody who was interviewing me said it makes me really depressed that the first part is called Politics and the second part is called Moral Visions, as if they're separate. And I said, well, that wasn't really the intent, but the Moral Visions part was an attempt to go a little bit deeper into some issues, and I couldn't cover all of them. I wanted to do one on environmental justice. I just ran out of time. So it's immigration, a moral vision on immigration, a moral vision on healthcare, Medicare-for-all, and then a moral vision, the last one is on economic equality. And in that chapter, I try to draw a number of threads together. And I try to, the idea of three supremacies came during a town hall that I did with former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich last fall, where he asked me what the most critical issues that were facing America today were. And it just came out in that moment, Kimberly, that it was, it's been a lot of thought along the way, but the way to express it is that there are these three supremacies that underlie or undergird or run through, whatever words you want to use, all of these other issues that we deal with. And they are corporate supremacy, the way in which corporations have managed to manipulate the rules of the game to have all wealth, all profit, all advantage go to them. And that is money in politics, but it's also the way in which laws are changed, in part because of money in politics, in part because of other factors. And they don't operate anymore for what the original charter of corporations was, which was to have some sort of common good, that a corporation was in business, but you had to show that you had common good, and your charters were time limited. They were dependent on your being able to prove that common good. And that has really affected the balance of power and wealth in this country. The second, individual supremacy, and I thought I might get into some trouble here because I know that we in the United States like to think about ourselves as, that we're all individuals and we pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and all of those, some myths that are out there about what that means. But the reality is that we as individuals exist in a collective, and our actions have to be linked to the idea that we are inextricably intertwined. And COVID shows us that, public health crisis shows us that. but certainly economic devastation showed us that as well. And that core idea that we don't exist separate from everything else, and our benefits don't accrue to us just as us, but we're all better off when we're all better off. So that's the idea of the individual supremacy, unfortunately taking a different tack and really putting an individual ahead of the common good or the collective. And then the third supremacy, and again, it was before, everything that's happening today, but for those of us who have been following and part of the movement for racial justice in this country, anti-Blackness and white supremacy is threaded through everything. And I saw it when I went to the state Senate. One of the first bills I wanted to do in the state Senate was to demilitarize local police departments by ending the transfer of federal military equipment to local police departments. And some of my Democratic colleagues told me that that was never going to happen. We couldn't do that. We couldn't go against the police. And so this anti-Blackness and white supremacy is so deeply intertwined in the psyche of everything from policing being set up to capture, people who were enslaved, and the whole culture of how policing is set up in this country and the framework of it, but all the way to the disproportional burden that we see Black people facing with COVID, double the number of deaths of white people in this country. All of those things I think are just, again, built into our psyche, and we've never told the truth about it. We've never had a real truth-telling about that racism and anti-Blackness and white supremacy and brutality against Black people and Indigenous people whose lands we took. And so I just think that those are deeply entwined in everything. And if we could address those three things, just those three simple little things, we would finally be able to tackle some of the deep problems that we have in this country.
So this is the point, Congresswoman, where if we were in a concert, you would be playing a medley of the greatest hits, right? It wouldn't satisfy anyone who was coming to hear you play this one song, but it would give people a sense of the breadth of what the portfolio actually looks like. So I'm going to ask you to do sort of a medley, and we'll do it sort of in the sense of what is now the low-hanging fruit, the things that as a progressive, you've been able to bring to the center of political discourse and actually make it within reach. Then the things that you had to reach a little bit more for, but you could bend the branch down and actually grab it. And the things that now, we have a ladder in this moment that we're able to get a little closer to, things that were way out of reach before now, but with progressive advocacy, linking up with what's happening in the streets and what's happening in Congress, things are actually within reach. So this is our Jayapal medley. So starting with what was in reach, the low-hanging fruit. What are some of the things that you've been advocating for that are in reach that are part of the medley?
Well, I think $15 minimum wage is definitely right there. I mean, we passed it off the floor of the House, and it is part of the mainstream Democratic platform. I think money in politics is another one where, it's going to be hard when we get into some of the details, but people are recognizing that, yeah, this is corruption at its worst, all this money in politics. So those are a couple of examples of low-hanging fruit. I think in terms of things that we have reached for, the branches we've managed to pull down, and we've got the fruit right there and it's really juicy, but we haven't taken the bite yet. I would say Medicare-for-all. For the first time, Kimberly, in the history of Congress, I was able to get multiple hearings on our Medicare-for-all bill. And it is a really comprehensive bill, as Katie said, and we worked for years or for months to with a big coalition of groups to really make it inclusive, to include long-term supports and services, to make sure that it was inclusive for everyone in and nobody out. And we were able to really move the ball forward on that. I would say that immigration reform is possibly there as well, but I really do worry about some of these pieces about defining immigrants as good immigrants or bad immigrants, and I do worry about that. I should have put criminal justice reform into the first one, because I think we have made enormous progress on marijuana legalization, on getting for-profit prisons shut, on taking the first steps around, sentencing reform, for example, and things like that. So we've got more to do in the second category as well there on criminal justice, but I think we're getting someplace on that. And then on the part about what is still sort of there, big ideas that are still very hard, I introduced a bill in a concept and the bill a little bit later called the Paycheck Recovery Act. And it was for COVID. And it was to say that in this time of crisis, what we should have done at the very beginning, and I took a hard vote in the Democratic caucus voting against the HEROES Act because I felt like it didn't address this critical issue of providing security and paychecks to people and keeping health benefits there. And forcing people back to work when they really should be staying at home to beat the virus. And this idea is something that European countries, Asian countries have all done, and that is to subsidize the paychecks of people and keep them in their jobs, because mass unemployment is a policy choice. It is a bad policy choice, but it is a policy choice. And I think we were able to change the conversation dramatically on that, but we haven't been able to get it passed yet. But today, in the Financial Services Committee, subcommittee hearing, we had a hearing on this topic with Joe Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winning economist, Lily Escalon-Garcia from the NEA, and others testifying on how important this idea is. And we're going to continue to push, because in many ways, it's the idea of a federal jobs guarantee that we really need to be moving to, so that there is real support and structure for people who desperately need it. So, a lot of things we're trying to move all at the same time. And I'm just an eternal optimist that we can get there. We just have to, continue to believe in the power of our voices and the power of mass movements, wherever they might be.
And the power of persuasion. So we laughed a little bit yesterday about having a little fun. So maybe we can do our little fun thing now, a little role play. So we know, even you've said, even in your immediate circle, there are those who are really, not really motivated right now to go running out and cast a vote for the likely Democratic nominee. Some of it is generational, some of it is, political, and some of it is like old heads, like me, who have bad memories of, Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill, and the Judiciary Committee. So there's got to be some serious talking going on to basically make this moment in November meaningful for the future of the country. So we talked about, what do you say around the dinner table or to your friends or your family who are just not feeling it. And so I thought, well, maybe you can use me as a guinea pig, right? So what do you say? Here I am. It's like, just the thought of voting for another, neoliberal, candidate who gave us a lot of these problems, from criminal justice to Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. If we keep wasting our votes, putting them behind people that really don't carry our water, we'll never be able to be like, the Republican Party, who's right wing is now running the show. We want to run the show. We don't want to be the wheels on the bus. We want to drive the bus. So we're not going to vote until it's our chance to vote, to drive the bus. What do you say to me? What do you say?
Yeah. So, what I say is, first of all, there is no progress possible with a dictator in office who is driving this country to fascism. There just isn't. And so we have to get Trump out. I have spent 4 years of my life fighting to make, the horrible a little tiny bit less horrible, and to keep hope out there. But we cannot do anything. And imagine if he gets reelected, what he is going to be like with, you know, a so-called mandate of the people to go, even if he's not winning. You know, we know the electoral college, well, I will just say, I don't think we should have the electoral college out there,
Yes, right.
but no progress is possible with Trump in the White House. He is destructive. He is dangerous. He is absolutely destroying the very foundations of this country. And so that's the first piece. And then the second piece is, look, I was a big Bernie Sanders supporter. I was his national health policy chair. I just finished being the co-chair of the health policy task force Sanders and Biden put together. And I was the co-chair for the Sanders side for health policy. And we're just about to announce our recommendations tomorrow, so you'll all get to see them. It's not Medicare for all. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. It's not, because our candidate did not win. But we did make substantial advances on many of these issues, from climate justice to healthcare. And that, to me, says that Joe Biden is somebody that we can push. And at the end of the day, we need at least somebody that we can push. And you know, I think that for our movements to work and to be able to make a difference, we need to have somebody in office who will be responsive to some of that pushing. And between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, there's a big difference there. And people who tell me that there isn't, I just have to say, I've been in the places where children were caged. I was in the prison where mothers were separated from their babies. I have watched this president use race baiting and bring back nooses into the public as an acceptable form of racism and you know, just unbelievable white supremacy. And so I just think that that is really important. And then the final thing is, look, we're getting ready to continue to build our movement so that we can actually elect at some point a more progressive Congress and have candidates running for president who can win and who we elect across the country. And there's some structural reforms that we need to do, and we need to continue to build our voice and our movements. And I've got a lot of faith that that can happen with our using the power you have, you know, really putting it all in. And it starts with voting in November. If we don't vote, the narrative continues to be that progressives and young people and folks of color don't vote, and we are not going to get the changes we need. So we need massive turnout in November. We need to get rid of Donald Trump out of the White House, and then we need to get to work on bringing justice and equity to our country again.
So there we have it. For anyone who's wondering what to say or how to say it, there it is. So I'm going to turn it over. Thank you so much, Congresswoman. This has been so just provocative and so interesting and inspiring. I know that Katie has some questions from our listeners. So Katie, turning it over to you.
Hi, thank you both so much. This has been just a really incredible conversation. I kept waiting to drop in because I didn't want it to stop. So I'm going to just take one question because I think that there's a bunch of issues in here, but one sort of synthesizes all of them. People are asking about DACA, they're asking about Medicare-for-all, the movement for Black lives. But so one of the questions is, as the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, can you tell us a bit about how you've worked with activists on the outside to win things on the inside? Because I think this question really does speak to all of those different movements and issues.
Yes, and that is in the book in multiple places. It's a theme throughout that in order to have successful policy, we need to design it together so that there is a sense of both what the demands are and what we can do to move a policy forward. And so, you know, we probably the biggest thing I talk about, one of the biggest things I talk about in here, separate from the Medicare for All hearings, is when Speaker Pelosi, or Leader Pelosi at the time, was running to be Speaker, how we worked with outside groups to get a number of things into that bargain. It was a negotiation. And we told the progressive groups to hold off on endorsing her. And Mark Pocan, my co-chair, wonderful co-chair from Wisconsin, and I went in to talk to the Speaker with a list of things that we wanted to see, which included things like getting some of our new members onto A-list committees, what are called A-list committees. They're money committees, basically. They control the money in the budget. And when people look at Katie Porter or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Rashida Tlaib on the Financial Services Committee, please understand it is because of our negotiation at the Congressional Progressive Caucus and our work with our outside progressive partners that we were able to say we want representation of new members that didn't before happen on these 8 committees, and we want representation that equals our proportion in Congress. So we're 40%, progressives are 40% of the Democratic caucus. We should have 40% of the seats on energy and commerce, on ways and means, on appropriations. And there were a number of other things in there, and the Medicare-for-all hearings came in as a negotiation as well. And it was really successful in both being clear about our demands and then actually getting that through. There are a number of other examples too around the Pentagon budget and other things that we fought for, but there's a lot of strategy that goes into it, and you have to figure out where your leverage is, and then you have to coordinate and actually be able to try to get everyone on the same page. And when we failed, it's been because we're not talking to each other and we're not coordinating our efforts to really maximize our power.
I can take, I guess, one more quick one, even though it's a big topic. So I think obviously the uprisings across the country right now that are making these demands about defunding the police and reallocating those budgets towards communities and other sort of basic supports. One of the attendees is asking about using that same framework to talk about military budgets and how we use that money and can kind of move it around in ways that are life-sustaining. So I wonder if you can kind of speak to that and some of where you think there might be possibility or opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a huge area, and the groups on, the progressive groups that have been pushing on this, and I've been a big leader on the budget committee. I had a number of amendments to cut the military budget. And again, this year for the NDAA, we will have 2 amendments, one that I've introduced with AOC and Barbara Lee for a $350 billion cut to the military budget. Obviously, that's huge. We obviously don't think that it's going to happen, but we're putting it out there as a stake in the sand to say what a bloated military budget this is, an agency that is not even audited, that is corrupt, that's wasting taxpayer dollars and sending American troops out where they should not be and sacrificing those lives, all at the expense of austerity when it comes to our basic needs like education and healthcare and all of the things that we know we need. And so there's another amendment that Mark Pocan and Bernie Sanders are doing that I'm a co-sponsor of to cut the military budget by 10%. So when we continuously bring up that this is our top priority, if we can sustain people and keep people together and not give votes for budgets that continue to cycle out of control, I think we can be successful on a significant cut to the military budget, particularly at a time like this, where so many people, 44 million people filed for unemployment in 12 weeks, where 130,000 Americans have already died, 27,000 of them in the last 5 weeks. This is devastation, and the idea that we would continue to put money into the military budget is just, in my mind, absolutely intransigent, and we cannot continue to let that happen. So we're pushing to say austerity spending on things that are necessary should not be discretionary, or spending on things that are necessary should not be discretionary. Austerity spending is bad. And so I think we're going to get that message across, and I'm grateful to the movement across the country that is helping us to fight for that.
Thank you both so much, Congresswoman Jayapal and Professor Crenshaw. I could honestly just sit and listen to you both talk all night. So I regret that this isn't a 5-hour event personally. But for everyone who came out tonight, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I think you obviously can see that this was an incredible conversation. I also want to invite all of you to join us at our next event, Thursday night, with my colleague Laura Marsh, as she talks with the novelist Lynn Stager-Strong on her new book, Want. That will be available on Zoom, just as this was, and our Facebook page on July 9th at 7 p.m. So to register for that, you can go to the events page on newrepublic.com. And I will close by just again thanking you both so much for your time and expertise and wisdom in this moment. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Kimberly. Thanks, everyone.
It was wonderful.